I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming back.
Secret parties, closed-door gatherings, late-night events hidden from cameras, private relationships no one ever acknowledged. And this time, it's not rumors. It's 50 Cent. On December 2nd, 2025, 50 Cent released a 4-part Netflix documentary that quietly shook the industry. Now 50 Cent is back with a new Netflix documentary, and this time, the names Diddy and Jay-Z keep appearing in the same private spaces. Not on red carpets, not in interviews, behind closed doors. In this new Netflix documentary, 50 Cent doesn't shout accusations about Diddy and Jay-Z. He reveals patterns. Patterns of secret meetings, patterns of restricted parties, patterns of silence that lasted for years. And once you understand how long Diddy, Jay-Z, and powerful names moved in a world without cameras, you'll understand why this documentary is making people uncomfortable right now. What the documentary shows first isn't noise or spectacle. It's intention. Before anything became public, before stories ever circulated, there were meetings that never appeared on schedules and never produced witnesses. Meetings held away from public view, in private rooms, at carefully chosen times. Spaces selected not for comfort, but for control. According to what 50 Cent documents, these weren't casual conversations between famous people crossing paths. These were deliberate moments, quiet moments, moments designed so that nothing would follow them outside the room. The same names keep appearing in these settings: Diddy, Jay-Z, not at events meant to be seen, not where cameras waited, but in rooms where privacy wasn't requested, it was assumed. The documentary doesn't tell us what was said inside those meetings. It doesn't speculate on decisions or agreements. Instead, it focuses on the structure, on the fact that these conversations never left the room by design. Private rooms reduce witnesses, private timing reduces questions, and conversations that never leave the room eliminate accountability. People who describe being around these moments talk less about words and more about atmosphere. Calm, controlled, confident. The kind of environment where power doesn't need to introduce itself because everyone already understands who holds it. And once those meetings ended, the setting shifted, but the intention stayed the same. Closed-door parties, not industry celebrations, not social events meant for visibility. Restricted gatherings where entry wasn't about fame, status, or invitation lists. Entry was about familiarity, about knowing the rules without being told. 50 Cent documents how these events were intentionally undocumented. No guest lists, no timestamps, no photos, no trails. If you were there, you already knew why you were allowed inside. If you weren't, you were never supposed to know it happened. Once again, the same pattern appears, the same controlled environments, the same familiar faces. And once again, Diddy and Jay-Z appear quietly inside those spaces, not acknowledged, not recorded, just present. These weren't chaotic nights spinning out of control. They were curated. Security filtered curiosity. Access filtered outsiders. Silence filtered everything else. Phones weren't taken away. They just weren't used. Cameras didn't fail. Why? They simply never came out. Because these gatherings weren't designed to be remembered publicly. They were designed to leave nothing behind. What's unsettling isn't what people claim happened inside those rooms. It's how carefully the outside world was excluded. How absence itself became protection. No posts the next morning. No casual mentions later. No stories passed around. Just silence. And silence, repeated often enough, stops looking accidental. 50 Cent doesn't accuse Diddy or Jay-Z of specific actions in these spaces. He documents patterns. How often the same names appear in the same restricted environments. How familiarity replaces formality. How repetition replaces coincidence. Because when powerful figures keep showing up in places designed to stay undocumented, the question isn't what happened one night. It's why these spaces existed at all. Closed-door parties don't just remove cameras. They remove witnesses. They remove records. They remove consequences. And once you understand that these meetings and gatherings were built to leave no trace, one thing becomes clear. Whatever followed later, the alliances, the silence, the unanswered questions, it didn't begin in public. It began here, in private rooms, at private times, between people who understood exactly why nothing could ever leave the room. Because when conversations never escape and nights leave no records, power doesn't need to hide afterward. It's already protected the moment the door closes. As the night stretched past midnight, the rules changed. These weren't events that happened while the world was still watching. They began after schedules ended, after attention faded, after visibility disappeared. Late-night parties, after-hours gatherings that existed outside normal sight, where time slowed and accountability thinned. According to what the documentary lays out, this timing wasn't random. The later it got, the fewer the eyes. The fewer the eyes, the safer the silence. And in these hours, the same names kept surfacing quietly. Diddy, Jay-Z. Not announced, not highlighted. Just there. These weren't extensions of public events. They were separate worlds. Locations shifted late. Entrances changed. What started as something ordinary transformed into something private without anyone needing to explain how or why. Phones weren't taken away. They simply stopped being used. Cameras didn't break. They just disappeared. No instructions were given. Everyone understood. People who remember these nights don't talk about chaos. They talk about atmosphere, how conversations softened after a certain hour, how familiar faces stayed while others drifted out, how the room felt different once it was clear the night belonged to a few. And what remains from those nights isn't footage, it's memory. Moments that were never documented, never posted, never acknowledged. Moments involving Diddy and Jay-Z that existed only in recollection. That's where certainty weakens. Memory can be doubted, dismissed, reframed. And in spaces designed to leave no record, memory becomes the only trace, and the easiest one to question later. It's also in these late-night spaces that the documentary introduces another layer, kept even farther from public view. Secret romantic relationships, not rumors shouted into the open. Not confirmations placed on record. Private involvement maintained carefully, far from public image. Connections around Diddy and Jay-Z were managed with precision. No shared appearances, no overlap between private proximity and public narrative. Two realities running parallel without ever intersecting on camera. Publicly, there was distance. Privately, there was continuity. That separation didn't happen by accident. Relationships don't stay invisible without effort. They stay invisible when everyone involved understands that acknowledgement would change everything. These connections were never acknowledged openly, never denied either. They were simply left untouched. Inside these circles, the rules didn't need to be explained. Where meetings could happen, when visibility had to end, which spaces were considered safe. Silence wasn't requested, it was expected. The documentary doesn't label these relationships as right or wrong. It asks a more revealing question. Why was public acknowledgement impossible? Why did protecting image require complete separation from private reality? Because when romantic involvement must exist entirely off record, it suggests exposure carried consequences far beyond embarrassment. consequences to reputation, to influence, to carefully protected narratives. Late nights made this possible. After hours, there were fewer boundaries, fewer questions, fewer people left to notice how often the same patterns repeated. And patterns did repeat, the same timing, the same settings, the same names, over years. By the time people recognized how consistent these nights were, silence had already settled in. It had already done its work. And what's unsettling isn't one memory. It's how many memories share the same shape. Because when moments are designed to exist only in memory, accountability fades with time. And when relationships are kept entirely outside public view, silence becomes the strongest form of protection. By the end of this section, one truth becomes clear. These late-night gatherings weren't about spontaneity or romance. They were about control. Control over timing, control over visibility, control over what could never be proven later. Because when nothing is recorded, everything can be denied. And when nights leave no trace, silence doesn't follow by accident. It follows by design. As the documentary moves forward, the tone shifts. This is where observation turns into discomfort. And the film raises concerns that were never spoken loudly at the time, only noticed, remembered, and later questioned. Alleged relationships involving young girls are not presented as facts, not as accusations, and not as conclusions. They are presented as moments that made people uneasy without fully understanding why. The documentary is careful. It does not describe acts. It does not claim crimes. It does not assign intent. Instead, it focuses on presence. Who was there? Where they appeared? And why their presence raised quiet alarms. Accounts describe young individuals appearing in environments clearly designed for adults. Late-night settings, private gatherings, restricted rooms where influence and authority already dominated the atmosphere. Nothing was announced as wrong in the moment. Nothing was challenged openly. But people noticed. On-age concerns were raised quietly, in side conversations, in exchanged looks, in warnings that were vague but deliberate. Be careful, said without explanation. When names like Diddy and Jay-Z were attached to those spaces, questioning felt risky. Not because anyone threatened anyone, but because power doesn't need to speak to be understood. Speaking meant risk. Silence felt safer. Some people describe confusion more than certainty. Others describe recognizing imbalance immediately, but choosing not to react. Careers mattered, access mattered, proximity to influence mattered. So discomfort was swallowed. What makes this unsettling isn't one moment, it's repetition. Different people, different years, different locations, the same uneasy feeling. The documentary doesn't ask viewers to decide what happened. It asks them to notice how often the same situation appeared, and how often it went unaddressed. And then the film turns to another layer of secrecy. Alleged relationships with men, not framed as scandal, not framed as wrongdoing, examined through the separation between private identity and public persona. The documentary makes a clear distinction here. This is not about judging identity. It's about concealment and the extreme effort placed on keeping certain parts of life completely invisible. Public image was tightly controlled, every appearance measured, every association filtered. The version of life shown to the world was consistent and polished. Behind closed doors, those rules changed. According to accounts, private connections existed only in spaces where cameras never followed and questions were never asked. No confirmations. No denials. Just silence maintained over time. What stands out is the discipline required. Different locations, different timing, different circles. Public life and private life were never allowed to overlap. That level of separation doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when exposure carries consequences. Consequences to reputation, to influence, to carefully built narratives. The documentary doesn't speculate on motives. It doesn't define anyone. It asks why secrecy had to be absolute, why even acknowledgement was treated as a risk. Because when something must be hidden this carefully, the secrecy itself becomes revealing. People describe how trust worked in these environments. Who could be present? Who could be relied upon to stay quiet? Who understood the unspoken rules without them ever being explained? Breaking those rules didn't lead to confrontation, It led to disappearance. Invitations stopped coming. Access faded. Connections dissolved quietly. Not as punishment, but as prevention. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from accusation. It comes from structure, from how power, silence, and imbalance overlapped, from how discomfort was noticed but never addressed, from how identity, whatever it may have been, had to remain completely hidden to protect something larger. Because this isn't just about relationships. It's about a system where silence mattered more than clarity. And in that system, questions didn't disappear. They waited. As the documentary moves deeper, the focus shifts to a different kind of connection, one that carries real weight inside the industry. Secret relationships with celebrities. Not casual friendships, not public collaborations, powerful names moving together privately while appearing separate in public. According to the documentary, Diddy and Jay-Z rarely appeared closely connected in interviews or public narratives. Different lanes, different moments, a visible distance that suggested independence. But behind closed doors, that distance didn't exist. Private gatherings, restricted rooms, after-hours environments where access was controlled and familiarity was unquestioned. The same powerful names kept appearing together where no one was watching, not photographed, not acknowledged, not explained. These weren't random run-ins. They weren't coincidences. The film shows how timelines quietly aligned. The same faces surfaced in the same private spaces across different years, different cities, different situations. Publicly, distance reduced scrutiny. Privately, familiarity preserved trust. And that contrast mattered. Public distance protected image. Private familiarity protected access. No announcements were needed. No confirmations were required. Everyone inside these circles understood how it worked. The documentary doesn't suggest secret plans or written agreements. It shows something quieter, mutual understanding, an understanding of when to appear apart publicly and when to move together in silence. Some accounts describe how certain celebrities always seemed informed before others, how reactions felt synchronized, how silence arrived at the same moment from different directions, not because anyone ordered it, because alignment already existed. This is how influence protects itself. When powerful people share private spaces, a silence becomes shared, not enforced, expected. No one benefits from breaking it. Reputation is at stake. Access is at stake. Entire careers are at stake. And then the documentary turns back to something heavier. Adult misconduct allegations. Claims of inappropriate behavior that have circulated quietly for years. Disturbing stories said to have happened behind closed doors. The film does not sensationalize these claims. It doesn't dramatize them. It documents how they surfaced and why they never fully disappeared. What connects these stories isn't detail. It's environment, private spaces, limited witnesses, power imbalances that made speaking feel risky. Different people describe similar unease, situations where boundaries were said to blur. Moments that didn't feel right, but didn't feel safe enough to challenge. At the time, many dismissed their instincts. Later, distance brought clarity, and when multiple people reached similar realizations independently, the stories stopped feeling isolated. They started feeling patterned. The documentary doesn't accuse Diddy or Jay-Z directly. It asks why these stories were never addressed openly, why explanations never followed, why silence replaced clarification every time? Because silence doesn't erase allegations like these. It preserves them. It allows questions to grow heavier instead of fading. It allows patterns to emerge where individual moments once stood alone. The film shows how private celebrity spaces can normalize behavior that would never survive public scrutiny. How repetition can turn discomfort into routine. How routine slowly erodes the instinct to question, and that erosion is dangerous. Not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it allows environments to exist without accountability. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from one allegation or one story. It comes from accumulation, from how often similar unease is described, from how consistently the same private settings appear, from how reliably silence followed, because discomfort doesn't come from nowhere. It grows where power goes unchecked, where visibility ends, where what happens behind closed doors is protected by design. And once those doors begin to open, even slightly, the focus shifts, not just to what may have happened, but to how long a system built on private familiarity and public distance was allowed to operate without ever being questioned. As the documentary continues, it stops focusing on events and starts focusing on presence. Well, not who was famous, but who was always there. Unspoken connections, private inner circles that never needed introductions, people who appeared repeatedly around Diddy and Jay-Z, across different locations in different years, without ever being mentioned publicly. They weren't announced, they weren't explained, they simply belonged. According to accounts presented in the documentary, these individuals moved through the most restricted spaces without hesitation. No passes checked, no questions asked. Their presence felt normal, even expected, despite the fact that no one outside the circle could explain who they were or why they were there. That kind of access isn't accidental. Access like that is built on trust, and trust like that is built over time. People describe how the energy in a room subtly shifted when these figures appeared. A conversation softened, behavior adjusted. Others instinctively understood where they stood without anyone saying a word. Authority didn't need to announce itself. It was felt. What makes this unsettling isn't that these inner circles existed. Every powerful space has them. What makes it unsettling is how completely invisible they were to the public narrative. No interviews, no mentions, no acknowledgement that these people even existed. And yet, in private environments connected to Diddy and Jay-Z, their presence was consistent. That absence from the public story wasn't oversight. It was protection. The documentary suggests these inner circles carried continuity. They remembered what others forgot. They understood how things worked when no one else was watching. Thus, silence wasn't something they were instructed to maintain. It was something they understood was required. And then the film moves into another layer of the same structure. Off-record relationships, privately maintained ties that were never confirmed and never denied. These weren't rumors seeking attention. They were relationships that existed quietly, deliberately kept outside documentation. No statements, no denials, no clarifications, just distance in public and familiarity in private. People describe how these associations were treated as understood truths inside the circle. No one asked questions because questions weren't welcome. No one demanded clarity because clarity would have created records. And records were the one thing these relationships could not survive. What stands out is how long these ties lasted. Public images changed. Narratives shifted. Controversies came and went. The private relationships remained intact, not visible, but consistent. Maintaining off-record relationships takes effort. It requires coordination. It requires shared understanding. Everyone involved has to know that silence benefits them all. Silence preserved access. Silence preserved influence. Silence preserved the system. The documentary doesn't suggest these relationships were hidden because they were fragile. It suggests they were hidden because they were valuable. Valuable enough to protect privately. Valuable enough to erase publicly. And over time, that split became normal. Public narratives stayed clean. Private realities continued uninterrupted. By the end of this section, one realization settles in quietly. And the most powerful connections around Diddy and Jay-Z weren't the ones people could see. They were the ones no one could name. The ones that never appeared on paper. The ones that existed only through access, proximity, and silence. And when relationships can exist for years without ever being confirmed or denied, they aren't hiding. They're operating exactly as intended, protected not by lies, but by the shared understanding that some connections are never meant to be spoken out loud. As the documentary widens its lens, the story stops being about moments and starts becoming about movement. Hidden alliances, not partnerships announced on stages, not friendships celebrated in interviews, but coordination that only made sense when viewed from behind the scenes. Publicly, Diddy and Jay-Z appeared separate, different paths, on different narratives, different public postures that suggested independence and distance. Privately, alignment kept surfacing. According to what the documentary traces, moments of public separation often match moments of private unity. Silence arrived at the same time. Attention shifted in the same direction. Reactions felt synchronized. without anyone ever explaining why. No meetings were announced. No agreements were documented. Just understanding. An understanding of when to appear apart in public and when to move together where no one was watching. This is how influence protects itself when visibility becomes risky. Behavior replaces paperwork. Timing replaces statements. Silence replaces denial. The film shows how industry responses often felt coordinated without being coordinated on paper. Questions went unanswered simultaneously. Curiosity was redirected quietly. Topics disappeared from conversations without ever being addressed. Not because someone gave instructions, because alignment already existed. Public separation wasn't accidental. It was functional. It reduced scrutiny. It scattered responsibility. It made accountability harder to locate. And within that structure, another reality never faded. Unverified but persistent accusations. Claims that didn't arrive with documents or court dates. Claims that didn't explode into headlines and then disappear. Claims that lingered. After 50 Cent's earlier documentary, many expected resolution. Clear responses, direct explanations. Something that addressed the patterns head-on. What followed instead was silence. No detailed denials, no clarifications, no attempt to dismantle the questions. And then silence doesn't erase accusations like these. It preserves them. The documentary follows how these claims resurfaced quietly over time, in private conversations, in careful warnings, in things people said without ever putting them on record. Different voices, different years, the same unease. Not identical stories, but familiar shapes. Private spaces, limited witnesses, power imbalances, and afterward, nothing. False stories usually collapse. They lose momentum. They fade when attention moves on. These didn't. They stayed. And staying changes how questions behave. They stop demanding belief. They start demanding attention. The film shows how unanswered accusations slowly accumulate weight. Viewers begin connecting timelines, comparing environments, noticing how often the same names appear around the same silences. That lack of response becomes its own signal. Because resolution doesn't require admission, it requires engagement. Here, engagement never came. Public separation continued. Private alignment remained intact. And that combination is powerful. It allows influence to operate without exposure. It allows protection without confirmation. It allows questions to exist without answers. By the end of this section, one realization becomes unavoidable. When alliances are hidden, accountability scatters. When accusations are left unanswered, they don't disappear. They settle. They wait. And once they've waited long enough, the story stops being about whether something can be proven. It becomes about why, even after 50 Cent's earlier documentary, the same questions were still left untouched. Because silence can protect power for a long time. But it also keeps every unanswered question alive, quietly building weight until patterns become impossible to ignore. As the documentary pushes closer to its core, it begins focusing on relationships that existed in a deliberate gray zone. Unconfirmed associations, connections that were never acknowledged publicly, never explained, and never denied. On paper, they didn't exist. In interviews and official narratives, there was nothing to point to. But privately, they never disappeared. The same proximity kept returning. The same access was granted. The same familiarity followed Diddy and Jay-Z from place to place. What makes this unsettling isn't secrecy alone. It's effort. Erasing a relationship publicly takes intention. Preserving it privately takes discipline. Both sides have to understand the same rule. Silence is safer than truth. And the documentary shows how public distance became routine. Appearing unconnected reduced curiosity. It allowed scrutiny to fade. Meanwhile, private access continued without interruption. Meetings still happened. Restricted spaces still opened. Familiar faces still moved freely. Inside these circles, no one asked for confirmation. No one demanded clarity. Clarity would have created records, and records were the one thing these relationships could not survive. That ambiguity became protection. If something isn't acknowledged, it can't be confronted. If it isn't confirmed, it can't be disproven. If it doesn't officially exist, responsibility becomes impossible to place. The film suggests these associations weren't hidden because they were weak. They were hidden because they were valuable. Valuable enough to protect privately. Valuable enough to erase publicly. And within those same private environments, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Power dynamics. These spaces were never equal. Influence controlled access long before anyone arrived. Who entered the room? Who stayed late? Who felt comfortable speaking? None of it was random. People adjusted instinctively, voices lowered, conversations shifted. No one announced authority. Everyone felt it. This is where significant age gap concerns begin to surface, not as accusations, but as alarms. Accounts describe younger individuals present in environments dominated by experience, status, and control. Late-night settings, restricted gatherings, rooms where power already leaned heavily in one direction. Nothing was officially questioned, nothing was openly challenged, but discomfort existed. People noticed imbalance. They sensed it in the atmosphere. They felt it in what wasn't said. The documentary doesn't describe acts. It doesn't assign intent. It examines structure. When age gaps exist alongside unchecked influence, vulnerability doesn't need to be created. It already exists. Younger individuals didn't set the rules. They didn't control the space. They didn't decide when things started or ended. Power did. And power shaped what felt possible to say and what felt impossible to challenge. Concerns surfaced quietly, inside comments, in warnings without detail. Advice like, be careful, delivered without explanation. That caution wasn't ignorance. It was fear of consequence. Because questioning power inside private spaces often meant risking access, careers, protection, and momentum. So most people chose silence. Not because they agreed with what they were seeing, but because silence felt safer than disruption. Over time, silence normalized imbalance. What once felt uncomfortable became routine. What once raised alarms faded into background noise. And routine is dangerous, because when imbalance becomes normal, accountability disappears. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from proof. It comes from repetition. The same structures, the same access, the same hesitation to speak, again and again. And when private spaces are built around unchecked influence, the question stops being what happened. It becomes how much could happen without anyone ever feeling able to stop it. Because power doesn't need permission to operate, it only needs silence. And in these spaces, silence was always present, quiet, consistent, and protective. As the documentary reaches its final movement, everything that once felt distant begins to pull together. Not into accusations, not into verdicts, but into pressure. For years, exploitation rumors existed quietly inside the industry. They were never shouted. They were never framed clearly enough to force action. They moved the way dangerous truths often do, softly, carefully, passed from one private conversation to another. Industry whispers, not gossip, warnings, concerns around vulnerable individuals surfaced in the same way. Not in headlines, not in statements, but in pauses, in lowered voices, in sentences that stopped halfway through. People didn't explain what they meant. They assumed others already understood. And what becomes clear in the documentary is that these whispers didn't drift randomly. They followed patterns, warning the same environments, the same restricted access, the same power structures repeating year after year. Different eras, different locations, the same unease. Someone would mention a concern only to discover someone else had noticed something similar years earlier. Not the same incident, but the same feeling, the same discomfort, the same sense that something about these spaces wasn't right. That's when coincidence stops being believable, because rumors don't survive decades without reinforcement. They survive because silence protects them. The documentary shows how this system didn't need threats or enforcement to function. No one had to be told to stay quiet. The cost of speaking was already understood. Access could disappear, opportunities could dry up, careers could stall without explanation. So people stayed silent, not because they believed nothing was wrong, but because silence felt like survival. This is how systems built on power protect themselves, not through denial, through exhaustion. People grow tired of holding questions alone. They convince themselves discomfort isn't enough to risk everything. They learn to look away from what feels unchangeable until something shifts. What shifts now is visibility. With this new Netflix documentary, the whispers are no longer isolated. They're placed side by side. Patterns that once felt personal now look structural. The same environments tied to Diddy and Jay-Z are no longer invisible. The film doesn't accuse. It doesn't conclude. It connects. And connection is dangerous for any system built on silence. Because silence only works when people believe they're alone. Once they realize they're not, the structure weakens. The documentary shows how repetition creates pressure, how awareness spreads quietly, how people begin to understand that what they noticed years ago wasn't isolated, it was shared. That shared recognition changes everything. The system hasn't collapsed, but it's no longer hidden. And once something built on silence becomes visible, it doesn't need to be attacked. It begins to strain under its own weight. Not all at once, not dramatically, but inevitably. Because silence can protect power for a long time, just not forever. Now, after 50 Cent's new documentary lays these patterns out clearly, the pressure isn't coming from allegations. It's coming from awareness, from the realization that the same concerns echoed for years, that the same structures repeated without interruption, that the same questions were never answered. This isn't the end of the story, but it is the moment the system stopped being invisible, and once enough people see the same pattern at the same time, the question stops being whether something will change. It becomes how long silence can hold, now that everyone is finally looking.